Our world is indeed changing as we speak.
Rusya ve Ukrayna'nın bu şekilde karşı karşıya gelmiş olmasından dolayı
Tonight, U.S.-led NATO troops and Russian forces are ramping up intense war games in the region, signaling both sides are preparing for a possible conflict.
Сегодня я инициировал телефонный разговор с президентом Российской Федерации. Результат – тишина.
From the Black Sea to Belarus, holding drills dangerously close to the border with Ukraine. NATO is beefing up its forces on Russian and Belarusian borders in response. Battle groups led by the US in Poland, German forces in Lithuania, Canadian troops in Latvia, and the British in Estonia.
Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences.
But from Russia's point of view, it's the one that feels threatened and wants to restore nuclear parity.
Overnight, in the capital of Ukraine, the sound of missile strikes and air sirens.
Tensions over the Ukraine crisis are at a boiling point.
Afraid that something will happen here, and I'm afraid of people who live in Ukraine.
The market is about to open on Wall Street as Ukraine and the invasion happening in Ukraine impacts stocks across the world.
We condemn this barbaric attack and the cynical arguments to justify it.
Our thoughts are with those killed, injured.
With as many as 5 million more people displaced by Russia's war of choice.
Last night, President Putin flagrantly violated the Minsk peace agreements by recognizing the supposed independence of the so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk in eastern Ukraine.
In 2014, the narrator compiled a study on the embryonic beginnings of the geopolitical conflict in the Ukraine. We all have our biases, we are human beings, but he tried to approach the topic as delicately and as balanced as possible by looking at the different sides of the situation. It was a learning process, and it was very interesting to see how a portion of the Earth can affect huge regions of the population of the planet, especially when you live on a sensitive political fault line that has huge gas reserves, and you are also the largest exporter of wheat in the world. As most of us depend upon the mainstream news for our perception of the world, we can easily be emotionally coerced into looking at the world without a thorough background to the situation. In 2022, the narrator has revisited this era again, and he paid a visit to London's Trafalgar Square with Ukrainian immigrants and their supporters chanting against Russian President Vladimir Putin. And if this study is allowed to be aired, many things may change once it is viewed, as the political climate is very unpredictable. This conflict is not really about Ukraine. She is just a political pawn and is strategically placed in the crossfire of something that is a lot bigger. She just happens to be in the way. This study will be covering a lot of history that will be building up to the present. For if you do not know the past, then you will not be able to make sense of or understand the present. It will have some prophetic undertones, but its main objective is to at least give people a sense of what is really happening. What is very interesting is that there is a global player the Ukrainian leadership is calling upon to mediate peace talks, the papacy. If she does intervene in that conflict, the whole world will see her as the global peace broker. Do they have amnesia? Has anyone ever studied her deeply rooted bloody track record on the European continent? The narrator will share a few brief things he has already presented in a number of previous studies as an update.
It is considered to be a success story of market socialism. It had higher rates of growth than most of the countries of Western Europe. It was a multi-ethnic society which lived in harmony.
The Pope apologized to the Serbs in the former Yugoslavia. Do you want to know why? Because of the papacy's meddling inside of that region. It was the papacy who supported the recognition of the state of Kosovo and of the secession of Slovenia and Croatia that led to the beginning of the 1990s Balkan Wars. And you can see the Croatian leader Ante Gotovina kissing the hands of the late Pope John Paul II. The Pope also beatified the Croatian Cardinal Alojzij Stepinac, who was a part of the brutal Ustashi government of the satellite state of Croatia. And you can see him in the background with a dog collar, with the government as they give their fascist salute. The Vatican has always worked behind the scenes with the tensions in Ireland, not because she loves the Irish, but because she wanted Catholicism to remain the dominant ideology on the Emerald Isle. Recent evidence has shown that it was Catholic priests who were working alongside the Irish Republican Army, better known as the IRA. The Spanish Church has recently apologized for their assisting Francisco Franco during the Spanish Civil War. And if this is not an object lesson for the world to see, and what is to come if she regains her supremacy over the continent of Europe, then woe to those who do not learn from the past. The narrator would like to make it unequivocally clear that he favors no Western government, neither choose any sides. For after the Second World War, the Vatican protected Nazis. Britain incorporated them into their intelligence service. Russia incorporated scientists from Nazi Germany that developed her nuclear program. And where would the United States and NASA be today if it wasn't for Nazi scientists? So, in a nutshell, they are basically all the same. In order to see how this conflict in the Ukraine plays out, let us see how this current generation is being educated in a New World Order school of thinking. This generation, though they live in the information age, is far easier at being deceived than any other generation in human history. And the narrator will give the three main methods of how the invisible government is shaping people's thinking. The education centers around the world via its schools, colleges and universities that are structured on a Western model trains you to blindly follow and not to think. And one man saw how this method worked from not only in the schools but also among the deep-rooted colonial thinking in your own homes. And this is what he said. When you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. You do not have to tell him to stand here or go yonder. He will find his proper place and stay in it. You do not need to send him to the back door. He will go without being told. In fact, if there is no back door, he will cut one for his special benefit. Why? His education makes it necessary. The churches were set up by God, who so loved the world, to restore fallen man back into the image of God and to strengthen the societies they live among, both morally, scientifically, intellectually, and economically. But today they have rejected their apostolic mission, and they are nothing more than money-making, groupthink controlling centers with an autocratic hierarchy. And one man saw how they also operate like the education system, to control people's thinking. And this is what he said. Organized religion can be as powerful as guns, indeed more so, since it can outmatch the destructiveness of armies, outsmart the fanaticism of political zealots, and look at the words highlighted, mobilize human emotions to an extent denied to any lay unit. The most powerful influence over the thinking of mankind today is definitely the media, which is the most powerful form of education or misinformation about the world. It is still structured and reported on a deeply biased westernized colonial model, where journalists can cleverly distort, twist and manipulate your view of the world. And this conflict has made it very clear that any form of independent thinking is going to be removed by force by the tech titans, so that the whole world can be coerced into following an unbalanced, one-sided New World Order worldview, which is the main Western colonial narrative. And one man knew that the media is functioning just like the Inquisition, and this is what he said. The US media, as with most of the news media in other Western nations, are not free and independent. They are owned and controlled by largely conservative corporate cartels that adhere to the self-serving neoliberal ideology of international finance capital. The goal of these political economic elites is to transform the world into a global economy under the tutelage of the transnational corporations backed by the unanswerable imperial might of the United States and its allies. The publicly owned media such as PBS and NPR in the United States or the BBC in Britain are not much better. They cannot be considered free and independent. They function in an enduring political culture, subject to pressures from those who fund them. Sometimes it can take months, years, or when all the global players are dead to really get to the root of why a conflict took place. But one thing the narrator has always known, the truth will always eventually come out. The Hoover Institute at Stanford University in California has some sensitive archived material that most people will never get access to. But one of its former staff members, the late British-American economist Anthony Cyril Sutton, had access to material from the First and Second World Wars, and he documented it in his book titled Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler. And this is what he said. Accurate history requires access to all documents. In practice, as previously declassified documents in the US State Department files, the British Foreign Office and the German Foreign Ministry archives and other depositories are required, a new version of history has emerged. The prevailing establishment version is seen to be not only inaccurate, but designed to hide a pervasive fabric of deceit and immoral conduct. What was not long ago a kooky idea, talked about at midnight behind closed doors in hushed and almost conspiratorial whispers, is now openly debated. Slowly, over decades, book by book, almost line by line, the truth of recent history has emerged as documents are released, probed, analyzed, and set within a more valid, solid historical framework. Though the narrator does not share Victor Hansen's apologist views of US foreign policy, he does give a very clear insight into how horrific World War II was.
So in other words, it was much more lethal than the Great Plague of the 14th century, the Black Death. It was more lethal than any tornado, earthquake in the history of the human experience. Of all the wars that have happened in the last 300 years, together, the death toll did not match World War II. There has been nothing like it. 27,000 people died per day for 6 years. A couple of other things that are just mind-boggling. It's the only war, major war, in which more civilians were killed. 80% of the 65 million were civilians. It's the only war where the losers killed 75% of the people. This was a total global war, all over the globe. There had never been weapons like this before in any war. This was a Western versus a Western war. It was not a Western versus a non-Western. It wasn't the British fighting the Zulus, where it was very quick and lethal because they had the technology and the others didn't. It was not a non-Western, the Aztecs fighting the Toltecs. It was a Western powers turning that tradition on each other at a time when they had reached the pinnacle of their excellence. So there had never been anything in the world like napalm. There had never been anything like the plutonium and uranium bombs. There had never been anything like a V-2 rocket. There had never been anything like a B-29. So technology accounts for a lot of it.
The Austrian-born German leader Adolf Hitler was supported by people you would least expect. The British newspaper The Daily Mail in the year 1998 documented that his war machine included imported vehicles from 2 US automobile companies, Ford and General Motors. But what few know is that Harold Sidney Harmsworth, the first Viscount Rothermere, who co-founded the British newspaper, was also a firm supporter of Adolf Hitler. Why is he, the head of the Daily Mail, paying a visit to Adolf Hitler? Because he had deep fascist sympathies. He thought that Hitler was superhuman, and he was the one who encouraged Hitler to invade Romania, and he used his newspapers to drive the war efforts. The Times of Israel knew he was a Hitler sympathizer, but there are still journalists in Britain who struggle with their own dodgy history. What about the British Broadcasting Corporation, better known as the BBC, the voice of global British journalism? Did it have its own secret sympathies for Adolf Hitler? John Charles Walton Reed, the very first Director General of the BBC, was known as an upright moral individual with Christian principles. But his own daughter has confirmed that he also adored and praised Adolf Hitler. Charles Vane Tempest Stewart, the 7th Marquis of Londonderry, a British peer, leader of the House of Lords and Secretary of State of Eyre, was a British politician who was also sympathetic and paid a visit to Adolf Hitler. He is standing on the left in this photo with Hitler. Edward, Duke of Windsor, abdicated the British throne and also paid a visit to Adolf Hitler with his wife. It was the Bank of England who helped to pave the way to fund Hitler's war machine. And the New York Times in 1942 documented that Standard Oil, today's Esso and ExxonMobil, gave the Nazis the patents to make rubber for its vehicles. It also documented in 1978 that the United States built up the Nazi war machine. By the end of the 1920s, IG had developed a solid partnership with Standard Oil. This connection would pay off for the Third Reich in the 1930s, when it began secretly and illegally building the Luftwaffe in preparation for the next war. Hitler's planes had to have ethyl gasoline corporation owned jointly by Standard Oil and General Motors, who supplied IG with the secrets for the tetraethyl process. And while IG was still building the plant to produce it, Standard supplied the additive itself. All this with the approval of the United States War Department. And the Associated Press, the US non-profit and the most respected global media journal, was also working secretly with Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. This is all documented in the book titled Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, known as a conspiracy theorist literature. This is why the narrator has always been apolitical, non-patriotic and not nationalistic, and never ever chooses sides in any of the global conflicts. Do you want to know why? Because years later you'll find out that the very people who are warring against each other are either secretly financing each other or are working secretly behind the scenes to orchestrate something that is a lot bigger than most of us can even comprehend by the hand of the invisible government. What about the previous European conflicts over territorial expansion that drew their colonies into their internal drama that made it to be called the First World War? The British monarch Queen Victoria, on her death in 1901, had 1/4 of the entire planet under British rule around the world. But years before her death, she attempted to mingle themselves with the seed of men, according to the prophetic language, by intermarrying each of her children into the monarchies of Europe. Did you know that Tsar Nicholas II, the Emperor of Russia, standing second from left with the bowler hat, was married to Princess Alix of Hesse, the daughter of the third child of Queen Victoria? At the funeral of Edward VII in 1910, standing on the far left is Haakon VII, King of Norway, who was married to Maud Charlotte Victoria of Wales, who was the daughter of Edward VII, the eldest son of Queen Victoria. Standing in the center in red is Kaiser Wilhelm II, King of Prussia, son of Victoria Royal, the eldest child of Queen Victoria. Seated on the far left is Alonso XIII, King of Spain, who was married to Victoria Juliana of Battenberg, the daughter of Princess Beatrice of the United Kingdom, the youngest child of Queen Victoria. And seated in the center is King George V, the second son of Edward VII. 4 years later, these families and their nation states would be killing each other for 4 years. The narrator in the previous study quoted General Smedley D. Butler. that World War I produced 21,000 millionaires and billionaires in the United States. And just as Anthony C. Sutton has confirmed, in the film The Kingsman, Hollywood is now openly telling us that men profited handsomely from people slaughtering each other, whose profit-making continued into the Second World War.
My flock, this will not be a war of heroes. Nations will slaughter each other while we get rich. This is going to be fun.
If you were to visit the very busy Piccadilly Circus in London, England, on a road called Regent Street, St. James, if you walk to the end of the road, you will see a monument dedicated to one of the many wars that was building up to the First World War. And on this war memorial engraved in stone, you will see the word Crimea, which, as we will see in a while, is one of the root causes of the modern Ukraine conflict. The monument has, I am guessing, British soldiers, not sure if there are any allies. And at the front of the memorial is a statue of a woman who the narrator was taught about while in primary school, Florence Nightingale, the woman who nursed soldiers back to health in the Crimean War. In the grounds of St. Thomas Hospital, as you walk off Westminster Bridge, opposite the Houses of Parliament, also in London, England, is another monument to a self-trained nurse from the Caribbean in the British West Indian island of Jamaica. Her name is Mary Jane Sicole. She built a hotel for wounded soldiers in the war in Crimea and also catered to their needs from her medical expertise. In recent years in the UK, there has been a very intense ethnocentric tug of war among historians, academics and politicians over who should be more credited in contributing their services during the Crimean War. But when you read Mary Sicole's autobiography, she gives a very fair and balanced account of both of their roles during that war, and this is what she said. Before I left Jamaica, war had been declared against Russia. An alliance of English and French cavalry preceded the Turkish infantry over the plain. The narrator has highlighted these four nations in blue for a reason, or it will help you to understand the modern conflict. Miss Nightingale came to supervise the Balaclava hospitals, and before long she had practical experience of Crimean fever. Among the diseases which I understood were most prevalent in the Crimea were cholera, diarrhea and dysentery. Should I not open a hotel for invalids in the Crimea in my own way? My one and only claim to interest the public, viz. My services to the brave British Army in Crimea. This portable photographic studio belonged to the English photographer Roger Fenton. He was appointed to capture the still shots of the Crimean War, where he showed the Western weaponry in the trenches, the Turkish military of the Ottoman Empire, the suave soldiers of the French military, and the British military who were in control over all the other nations. Though there are new players on the global war theatre in Ukraine like NATO. In an article in the Moscow Times, it documents how there is a frightening similarity between the players in the 19th century Crimean War and the current war. This photograph by Roger Fenton with three men sitting at a table in the Crimean War has been titled The Council of War, 7th of June 1855. Seated on the left is Field Marshal Fitzroy Henry Somerset, the English officer who was organising the war strategy to invade Russia. Today, under the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, the UK not only has British NATO troops on Russia's border, but wants to isolate Russia diplomatically and financially with sanctions. In the centre is seated Ekrem Omar Pasha, the Austrian-born Orthodox Serbian who fled to Turkey and converted to Islam. He was an Ottoman field marshal and officer in the Crimean War. Today, Turkey is right in the middle of the Ukraine conflict, as it has ties to both Russian President Vladimir Putin and the current head of the state of the Ukraine. Though President Erdogan won't accept moves on Ukraine's sovereignty, Turkey is friends with Ukraine but won't cross Russia's red lines, for Turkey is both a member of NATO and a friend of Vladimir Putin, for Russia provides its gas and technical assistance, but Ukraine wants Turkey to close Black Sea access to Russian vessels so that Russia's warships do not have access to the Ukraine. For Turkey has a trade and drones deal with Ukraine, and Russia is angry that Ukraine's drones that are being used against the Russian army are being supplied by Turkey. This is how messy and nasty geopolitics is. Seated on the right is Amiable Jean-Jacques Pelissier. Forgive the narrator's wrong pronunciation. He was a French marshal who commanded the French forces in the Crimean War. And 2 centuries later, France's Macron discusses the conflict in Ukraine with Russia's Putin. And since the start of the invasion, France has also suggested sanctions should be put on Russia. Macron wants to make France the world leader in renewable energy, where the sales of France's energy company Total have reached the highest in its history. And as France is not too dependent on Russian energy like other nations, she's a lot bolder in her demands. So if you closely study European conflicts, they are rooted in deep unresolved issues going back centuries. And the conflict in the Ukraine, like the Balkan Wars in the 1990s, are over the exact same issues in the exact same geopolitical spaces. So what exactly was the First Crimean War over in the 19th century? We shall quote 2 historians who have been labelled as conspiracy theorists. In a book titled Tragedy and Hope, the late Georgetown professor Carroll Quigley said that Russia made war on Turkey 5 times in the 19th century. On the last 2 occasions, the great powers intervened to prevent Russia from imposing its will on the Sultan. The first intervention led to the Crimean War from 1854 to 1856 and the Congress of Paris in 1856. The Tsar, as protector of the Orthodox Christians of the Ottoman Empire, occupied the principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia, north of the Danube and east of the Carpathians. Under British pressure, the Sultan declared war on Russia and was supported by Britain and highlighted in green, France and Sardinia in the ensuing Crimean War. In a book titled Occult Theocracy, the late Edith Starr Miller, repeating Carroll Quigley, also said that the Crimean War, England and Piedmont worked up a quarrel with Russia about Turkey over the respective spheres of influence of the Christian, Greek and Catholic churches at Jerusalem. This rivalry was of little consequence either to England or Piedmont, but it served to turn and highlighted in green France against Russia on the pretext of protecting Turkey. 2 centuries later, France is the European mediator concerning the Ukraine conflict, where Macron discusses the era of conflict with Putin, then condemns, as we've already said, the invasion.
By backing down on his word, by refusing a diplomatic choice other than war, he hasn't just wounded Ukraine, he has also undermined the sovereignty of Ukraine. He has decided to strike peace and stability in Europe, and it is the worst strike that we have seen for decades. We anticipated this crisis together. We undertook stringent dialogue alongside our allies and our European partners. We did everything to avoid this situation, this war, but it is here and we are ready.
Most of the world is sadly looking at Vladimir Putin and the conflict in the Ukraine from a US foreign policy, State Department emotional appeal perspective in both religious and secular circles, which is why they cannot assess the situation properly. If the war-mongering United States of America is controlling your perception of the world through the corporate-controlled Western media with a deeply biased, one-sided worldview, then they can make you believe absolutely anything. Many years ago, the narrator's spiritual mentors schooled him that there are three sides to a story: your side, my side, and the truth. And if we are to carefully assess this situation, it is only fair that we give an ear not just to the West only, but to Russia also, so you can clearly see what is going on.
For the last 200 years, our country has operated under the Monroe Doctrine, embracing the principle that as the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere, the United States has the right, according to the United States, to intervene against any country that might threaten our alleged interests. That's United States policy. And under this doctrine, the United States has undermined and overthrown at least a dozen countries throughout Latin America, Central America, and the Caribbean. The fact is that the U.S. and Ukraine entering into a deeper security relationship is likely to have some very serious costs for both countries.
NATO famously promised Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev that it would not move an inch to the east.
Даже такие были выражения, как это было у Бейкера, у секретаря, что мы и на 10 сантиметров не двинемся в интересах НАТО или что-то.
Recently declassified documents on the 1990 negotiations proved Russia's account is accurate. Of course, NATO and the US say their missile defenses are not against Russia, but against Iran and North Korea. But the locations tell another story. Missile defense installations were placed in Poland, Romania, California and Alaska. They're also planned for Japan and South Korea. Missile defense ships patrol the seas close to Russian territory.
Создаются системы, элементы систем противоракетной обороны, что нас очень беспокоит, и мы постоянно об этом говорим в течение 10 лет. Это разрушает стратегический баланс в мире.
The balance is disrupted, and Russia, which hasn't ramped up its missile defenses like the US, is facing a deadly danger.
Вы же все понимаете, о чем идет речь. Чего молчите-то? Вы все молчите. Ситуация усугубляется. Ведь это подталкивает гонку вооружений. Новый виток создает. Это же очевидная вещь. Вот мы все время думаем, а как ответить? Мы думаем, совершенствовать систему, преодоления систем противоракетной обороны.
For the first time in history, the NATO response force has been activated. ABC 10 News reporter Mimi Alcala explains the reasoning behind that.
The United States has more than 90,000 U.S. service members based in Europe, with thousands of troops receiving deployment orders in recent weeks and days as Russia continues to attack Ukraine. Though unclear, Representative Juan Vargas says he believes we could possibly see local service members heading there as well. The multinational force includes land, air, sea, and special operations forces that NATO can quickly deploy where needed.
What does it look like? How many? And where does the alliance want to place them? All of that is still being worked out.
Ukraine is not part of NATO, though NATO member countries border it. U.S. service members have been moving farther east into those areas to provide support and deter aggression against NATO. But President Biden has insisted that they won't be going into Ukraine. But if Russia attacks a NATO country, the U.S. would then be required to step in.
Why is Ukraine's accession so dangerous? There are problems. European countries, such as France, think that Crimea is part of Ukraine, and we deem it part of the Russian Federation. If there are any attempts to change the situation using military means, and Ukrainian doctrine says that Russia is an adversary and that Crimea may be returned by military means, now imagine Ukraine as a member of NATO. Article 5 is not repealed. To the contrary, President Biden has said recently that this article is imperative. It will be implemented. This means there will be a military confrontation between Russia and NATO. And I asked at that press conference, are we to go to war with NATO? But you're the second part of this, and I'd like to ask you, do you want this war? Do your readers, do your audience, want this war? A war between Russia and NATO? This is how it will happen if events run this way.
If you ever study history and the root cause of most domestic or global conflicts, they are usually over land expansion and the natural resources that the land produces. And if you listen to President Vladimir Putin very carefully, his deep concern was over Ukraine being incorporated into the United States-dominated intergovernmental military alliance of NATO, where, as we have seen, though Ukraine is not officially a member, it will have a huge US military presence that will be uncomfortably sitting on Russia's doorstep, which, if you understand America's bloody track record of blatantly overthrowing nation states, it will cause any intelligent nation to protect its borders. This is the main reason of the invasion. Now, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, that is up to the viewer to make their own decisions. In the German journal Spiegel, Putin accused the West of crossing red lines and warned of drastic consequences if anyone intervenes. It also asked, is Vladimir Putin right? For Vladimir Putin insists that the West cheated Russia by expanding NATO eastward following the end of the Cold War. You promised us in the 1990s that NATO would not move an inch to the east, Putin said in late January. And he is using that history to justify his current demands for written guarantees that Ukraine will never be accepted into the Western alliance. So how will this impact our everyday lives? Roman Abramovich is a Russian businessman and billionaire whose grandmother was born in the Ukraine, and he is known to be historically linked to President Vladimir Putin, where he apparently is trying to broker a deal between Russia and the Ukraine. He is also a Russian Jew with recent Israeli citizenship and is known as the first or the second richest man in Israel, where he hosted the Israel president Isaac Herzog at Stamford Bridge. And the BBC discovered leaked documents that have been traced to him, where he donates millions to El-Ad, the Israeli settler group that forcefully removes Palestinians off their land, which, if it is questioned or challenged, is usually called anti-Semitic. He owns the British football team Chelsea, and as may be under investigation by UK's Parliament, he has attempted to cleverly cover his tracks by giving it to a stewardship and charitable foundation, but he still technically owns it. This is how deeply interconnected the Ukraine conflict is, but he is not the only one. Alexander Dukov is also a prominent Russian businessman. But what connection does he have to football, especially the Union of European Football Associations, better known as UEFA, the Champions League football competition? On the official website of the Russian energy company Gazprom, on the far right in the middle are all the different sporting associations it financially sponsors. And today UEFA is under pressure from severing ties with Gazprom as the Ukraine crisis escalates. But guess who is on the board of UEFA? Alexander Dukov, where if you look at the bottom of this website, he is an executive member since 2021. He is also the chairman of the management board and CEO of Gazprom Neft. Deep. So the Russian businessmen have a strong foothold over the sporting entertainment world via their wealthy energy companies like Gazprom. But if you live in the UK like the narrator, we can look at what Russia can do to different nations concerning Ukraine if they are threatened with sanctions.
Clearly, the huge escalation in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is going to have an economic impact. The most obvious point will be energy prices. Russia and the Ukraine, it's a huge supplier of gas. And in the UK, we don't just use gas for gas, but much of our electricity is generated by gas when our renewables, the wind isn't blowing, for example. And of course, this is likely to see a huge increase in wholesale gas prices. We've seen a spike today. The prices that energy firms pay has rocketed. The big question is how long that will last. The next big impact will be on the price of oil. When you have instability, when you have a conflict, especially a big conflict that affects Europe, you're likely to see the oil price rise. And again, over the last few days, that has increased to unprecedented levels, which is why already at the petrol pumps, we're seeing prices at new records. But this isn't just about filling up, because most goods that we buy, most things that go to factories, they come in lorries, they come in ships, all of which are ultimately powered by oil. So oil going up increases the prices that suppliers pay, increases the cost of delivering goods to us, and is hugely inflating in the price of food and many of the goods we always buy. So if this lasts a long time, most things will go up in price.
Thousands of people in the UK die in their homes and on the streets of the freezing cold every year. And according to the official UK data, the Office for National Statistics, an estimated 28,300 excess winter deaths occurred in England and in Wales in winter 2019 to 2020, which was 19.6% higher than winter 2018 to 2019. And while people are dying, the profits of the energy companies expand in revenue and in wealth. The BBC asked the question: how reliant is Europe on Russia for oil and for gas? And the Financial Times in the year 2021 answers that question. It said that Europe is one of the regions that is most dependent on gas. It is used to supply a fifth of its energy, but most of its supply comes from outside of the EU, in particular from Russia. Following the breakup of the Soviet Union, most Russian gas exports to Europe flowed through existing pipeline infrastructure in, guess where? Ukraine. The other main route around Ukraine is via the Baltic Sea. In 2011, Gazprom started up the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, the longest subsea pipeline in the world. Today, it accounts for about 40% of all natural gas exported from Russia to the EU. The Telegraph said that Russia is warning that gas prices will double if Nord Stream 2 is blocked. And The Economist said, how will Europe cope if Russia cuts off its gas? Have you thoroughly sat down and counted the cost of this conflict?
But there's another reason to pay close attention to this area. It's one of the most important wheat-producing regions on the planet. And no matter where you are in the world, wheat is everywhere, including in the things we buy every single week.
As the markets continue to experience volatility with the tensions between Russia and the Ukraine, several metals are realizing higher prices. Looking at the top producers of various metals, palladium appears poised to experience the greatest impact should tensions continue to escalate. Russia is the largest producer of palladium and the second largest producer of platinum in the world. Russia produces approximately 40% of the global mining production of palladium. Palladium is a crucial component to catalytic converters and used in the production of jewelry, dental fillings, in addition to several other industrial uses such as fuel cells.
Halima, Russia is the second largest natural gas exporter, third largest exporter in the world of oil.
Now we have one of the world's largest oil and gas producers in an active conflict situation soon to be subject to the most severe economic sanctions from Western powers. And there are grave concerns that Russia may look to withhold energy supplies in order to punish Western nations for imposing sanctions. This is a story that has major impacts for commodity markets.
And so, Halima, Russia is also one of the world's largest exporters of key commodities in the agricultural and mineral markets. So how do you think that factors into Russia's plans moving forward?
Yeah, that's a great question, because we keep saying that Russia is not a gas station. Russia is a global commodity superstore. It is the Walmart of commodities. It is the world's largest wheat producer. Combined, Russia and Ukraine account for a quarter of global wheat exports. It's a major palladium producer, major nickel producer. Ukraine is considered the breadbasket of Europe. They account for large quantities of corn exports, barley exports. There is grave concern that at a minimum, we may see Ukraine's commodity exports, the agricultural exports in particular, disrupted if they cannot move supplies through their ports. So this has the potential to really exacerbate inflationary pressures that we were already concerned about.
I think we are in for a long haul, and it's going to be very uncomfortable for all parties involved, especially the Ukrainians who are going to be stuck in the middle. As you pointed out, Russia has prepared itself for the reality of sanctions. Now, we'll see, because prior to this, we had the theory of massive sanctions. Russia knows sanctions. They've been sanctioned by the West since 2014. Russia understands how its economy works. It understands what its vulnerable points are. And I'm sure they've prepared for it. You know who hasn't prepared for any of this? Europe and the United States.
That's right.
Because if these sanctions go down the path they look like, Europe is going to suffer egregiously. Their economies will collapse. Many of the European nations that are currently right now pounding their chest about how tough they're going to be crying in pain as their economies collapse. And you know who else isn't prepared? The American people. When gas prices go through the roof, when inflation goes through the roof, when the economy collapses, when their paycheck is worthless. And Russia isn't going to budge. Let me just make that point. I don't believe Russia is going to budge. Russia is going to stick to its principles, stick to its arguments, and the West is going to have to come to them.
If this man's political foresight is proven accurate, this conflict that has far-reaching and deep repercussions that your average person is aware of will have a massive impact on the global financial markets. It will cripple your average person's income, which will eventually take the world onto a course where no man might buy or sell. And I suppose that invisible enemy in the air and its one-sided narrative that has greatly disrupted people within 2 years will quietly be swept under the carpet. What the narrator has found very annoying is the Western Church's reaction to this conflict, because it is taking place in the West. When the Pope says pray for Ukraine, most of the Western churches respond with hashtags and social media memes in response to the advice of the man in the Vatican. Was it the same zealous drive to pray for the people who are suffering in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, who have experienced and suffered from far worse casualties? You see, the Holy Scriptures divinely advises us that I exhort, therefore, that, first of all, supplications and what? Prayers, intercession and giving of thanks for who? Be made for and highlighted in red all men. Men meaning both male and female. Who else? For kings, that is, world leaders, heads of state, and for all that are in authority. And why is this prayer important? That we may lead a quiet and peaceful life in godliness and honesty. For this is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Saviour, who will have, who, highlighted in red, all men to be saved, and to also come to the knowledge of the truth. This was just an update on the situation in the Ukraine. And as the narrator encourages the viewers at all times, before you get emotionally drawn into this conflict by the dominant one-sided Western media narrative, and its continuous fast-paced filmed imagery. And before you take on board anything the narrator has presented, please research everything you see for yourself so you can protect yourself from anyone duping you into a mesmerizing, fanciful idea. Because this conflict does not look like it is ending anytime soon. So fasten your financial, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual seatbelts, because this looks like it is going to be a very long ride that is going to greatly affect and impact every single one of us here on this earth.